I can feel the ID struggle. Like I like been there myself a couple of times, and I have yet another adopting Bazel talk, or what we do at a large scale migration, or at least what I call large scale. It really depends. There's a lot of things you can do, but actually to give you an idea why I think it's large, or well, at least in our case, it's large scale. I prepared a little bit of context. We have many different teams and projects at Salesforce. So I work at Salesforce, and we started looking into. I joined the build team 2018. That's when the build was still all that mixture of Maven and Ant. I say mixture because there was an attempt to migrate from Ant to Maven. That was successful, except that they finished right after producing the draw files in Maven, and then everything else remained in Ant for whatever reason. And because I mentioned Ant and Maven, the dominating language in our code base is Java for the backend, and it's TypeScript in the front end. It's a monolith, which is very important, which means like you're really like it's all of the code and it's single set. Right? We do have microservices in the backend, but that's a different build, and they are independent. And my responsibility is the monolith, which started originally very, very small. Back in Salesforce is now 25 years old. So, and some code lines are like that too. Still work today. A single repository, we're in the process of moving from Perforce over to Git. Perforce is still the backend, but now these days all developers are actually using Git. There's a ton of tools involved into it, and luckily, because Salesforce is software as a service, we only have like 2 branches a developer needs to care about. It's main and the current maintenance / patch branch, which is a bit convenient because like you don't have to worry about supporting all the old stuff a while back, but yet still it's very challenging, interesting from the migration perspective. Let's see. Yeah, one thing that's very, very consistent is the code growth. Is there actually? But yeah, you can see that little flat line was one release. It was the first COVID release. No, well, we're really just like trying to adopt everything, but we're making 3 releases a year, and we're going, right? And with every release, the code grows, as did the build time. Also, it's not, there's like this consistency. It's like the growth is in every language. It's not just everything, right? So that's an analysis on the repository. The reason you see there's a lot of SQL and XML, that's actually because we do a lot of code generation here as well. Yep, these are some of the numbers. We have about 270 teams, 3,500 developers, release to release, contributing, writing to it. And this is why I believe what I would like to tell you, why I think in our case it's a large scale migration. Because there's some technical challenges, but actually most of the challenges aren't technical at all. Initially we thought, well, it's a simple journey, right? We do some experimentation. We then had the opportunity to do a long experimental phase. Then there's a development phase where you actually, then you roll it out. That is approximately the timeline. Actually, if you want to break it down, it's funny. That was 2018. That started 2019. That started 2021. And we're here right now, somewhere in terms of timeline. And you wonder why is that true? The reason is really we have this, when you have an application with 3,500 developers or a stack with 3,500 developers, there's no way you can do a big bang migration. And I think this is the most important thing for everyone to remember. Like today, we're on the rollout phase, which means that from the very beginning till the end, everything is still Ant and Maven in parallel to Bazel. And this is what introduced the complexity from a technical point. But actually, that's not what I want to communicate to you. The important piece, I think you need to rethink of these large migration projects around this thing that you need, the vision in the middle. You always have, and during all these years, this is like, it requires a lot of things to think about, but you always have to keep focused on the outcome. And the outcome is, from our perspective, wasn't just Bazel. The outcome actually was much simpler. We need to kill Maven and Ant. It is. No, that's the definition of done. You're not done when you migrate to Bazel. You're done when you killed Ant and Maven, right? And that explains why the journey becomes way more interesting, because then all of a sudden, like 2 years into this project, you start discussing entire new areas of teams using things that you thought were dead. They're still there, right? And then you need to, and that's why I'm also draw this as sort of the circle, because it's not a linear journey. If you experiment, you start development, you discover something new, you need to go back to experimentation and planning. And the most important thing that we totally underestimated in this project is when you work with 3,500 developers, education and support. This is actually most of the challenging things that we had to face, because like the education is not just the build tool. We are literally changing how developers work. In Maven, and that's why I'm saying we've been at the IDE struggle. Our Maven build isn't great. Like the P80 time for the developers is approximately half an hour. That means that over the years, the developers adopted a code style or a working style where they did most of the work in the IDEs, and then they only built like once or twice a day. And so they started to get very comfortable to their IDEs. And that's why I'm saying education and support. And because when you then start doing the developer rollout, and then say, oh, hey, by the way, you have to use that Google IntelliJ plugin now. And it sort of works, but then they discover, oh, wait a minute. Hot swap is no longer 3 seconds, but 3 minutes. Right? And then you need to go back to the planning experimentation phase, because you can't roll this out. You need to fix this first. And this is interesting that, or the perspective that I like to bring to this, that a Bazel migration or any build system migration is not just about the build system, but there's a lot of aspects around this, right? And developer experience is one big piece. And yes, there's the other big piece is I say, me as I work for the build team, and I say I have 2 customers, right? There's the developers, but I also have the organization that cares about build time and cost and compute that's being spent. That's a big piece, but also the developer experience is not to underestimate. So what we actually did is part of the development work, we did a lot of, and luckily I heard this, I was at the first BazelCon in 2019, and that's where I went to a talk and someone told me, yeah, don't use general. It's good for exploration, but try to do real use. And we did it. We have very few use of generals. There's one team that's still experimenting with it, but really that's also why we took the time for development, and we've written 45 different rule sets for our internal source code generators, because we use a lot of source code generations. But now that actually helps us, because we are, in terms of timeline, we are about to complete the developer rollout. So that's 2 weeks away. Then on the main branch, everyone is using Bazel. No one is supposed to call Maven anymore. And we are already focused on the production rollout, because that's the other interesting thing. Why also we had to do so many testing and planning and all this kind of aspect is when going from Maven to Bazel, you're not just changing the build system, you're also changing the class path. And for a Java application that's running in production and with thousands of customers, billions of dollars of revenue, you better save than sorry. Right? And but this is now, we're now in that very interesting phase where we believe, based on the evidence and the testing that we have, that we covered all the use cases. And yeah, and then and so when that is done with that rollout, right, we're almost ready, and we have now actually a couple of teams lined up that are waiting for us to actually give the go ahead that Maven is no longer being used. Right now, we still need it because it's part of our rollback plan. So that's also why we cannot just refactor freely or use the Bazel targets freely. We have to use it in a way that the Bazel graph is designed in a way that it's always backed by a Maven. Maven can support this, right? So that's why we still have these things that the example I was giving earlier, hotspot taking 3 minutes, is because it takes 3 minutes to build a draw file. We cannot go much more fine-grained, but with Bazel you have to go fine-grained. And that actually brings me back to the education piece. If you you need to figure out a way to, from day one, go out and find allies in the developers and educate them as sort of what we actually did. We created a Bazel Champions program internally, so that in each organizational unit, we started to work with 30, 40 experts that had an interest in build systems as well, but weren't directly working in the build team, but sort of became the experts for us with the domain knowledge. Because when you have such a huge code base, you sometimes have to make changes that do require a little bit of Java modification or code modification, right? To decouple things, because they actually most of the things we discovered is that, especially around test code, there's so much things relying on bucket classes being there. You have no idea what developers write, and also that comes back to the support piece. Is like a lot of support requests we get is my Bazel build is broken. I changed this input, but I'm not seeing the new output. Actually, then now educating people to look into Bazel bin folder, or actually just educating them, telling them you don't have to worry anymore, right? Bazel is doing the right thing. Just start the app. Turns out Bazel was doing the right thing, but the app was still looking in the auto location for loading. So when we did, as part of the developer rollout, we also learned that developers should not just migrate their source checkout, but really throw it away and start over to make sure that there's no old pieces lying around from the old system. That's also very wise to do when you do, in our CI systems, they're also so optimized, right? And because we're doing this parallel build of Maven and Bazel, we also had to kind of split it out and mix it up, everything. Yeah, and then it was quite an interesting ride, but actually I think, and I believe in the end, it's really, really helping us to support, and now making the switch from the developer to the organization as the other customer that I have as a build team, is to supporting the growth that the company still wants and does with the code base. Because all what these teams want to do is writing features. And we're actually already looking into, because one thing that I would like to do is take away dependency management from developers somehow, right? Make it more strategic, or more like that. We give the guidance, you just place your code in that folder, and we figure out updating the build files for you based on the APIs that you're allowed to see and are allowed to use. Because that's another thing that we learned, is that when you have such a huge application, huge monolith or monorepo, it's almost impossible to educate every single team, every single engineer, how the architecture should look like. So what we actually then build is right now we're working on a visibility tool for Bazel that helps us manage and enforce the visibility rules on all these targets, because we do not want well, some developers want to, but we do not want to give everyone the freedom to write the visibility rules that they need. And unfortunately, we are not, from an source control perspective, we're not there yet that we can enforce, let's say, okay, every build file needs to be reviewed by a build team expert. That doesn't scale, right? So like we can't become the single bottleneck. So we started to create more tools around enforcement. And the visibility tool is one of them. We also have another one around, another thing is compilation. Our Maven build, for example, our Maven build was using the Eclipse Java compiler. So we had to wrap that and integrate that with Bazel. And then it turns out that actually the Eclipse Java compiler is almost as fast as the Turbine header compiler. So we didn't need to run header compilation anymore. But now that in the end, just recently, I discovered a different problem with some teams were trying to do aspect J. And because we started recently, we are already in the rollout phase, but now that we have Bazel, we began to look into remote execution as well, especially around our cloud development environments. And one of the interesting things we discovered there is that with aspect, we went back to header compilation in order to scale out. But then you also learn that there's things like aspect J that do bytecode manipulation, but they do it on the full class files, not on header files. So you actually had these things in the middle of the build graph that all of a sudden basically couldn't scale out anymore because, yeah, you had to wait on that giant 10-minute draw file to finish building before you can move further. So still 6 years into the project, we're still learning. It's amazing. But I think, if you need never lose focus on the vision, on the outcome. That's very, very important if you want to do a large scale project. And if you can, I remember 2019, there was this keynote from the BMW group where they actually did it much faster. They stopped developing. There were only 150 engineering organization back then, so they stopped development, and then all these 150 people migrated the build scripts for their teams within like 2 weeks. And then they spent another 4 weeks fixing, and then but it's like, yeah, we went to our executives, and they are just like, yeah, no. Well, we're not stopping development for 6 weeks or something like this, right? So you cannot do that. But sometimes that's also a totally viable option, right? If your team is small enough, if you like, and you have that opportunity, why not? Don't really have a translation, but in Germany we say it's close your eyes and through, power through, right? This one is a little bit, was a little bit more interesting from a project perspective, but now I think we're seeing the end of the light. So if everything goes right, probably in October, we will be able to start deleting the first benefits. Questions?
Thank you. So you were talking about build file generation. Are you using Gazelle with a custom extension or something like that, or something homegrown?
No, that is still TBD, because I think it depends I personally think it depends heavily on the IDEs. I would like to see build files, or at least the dependencies, being generated and written by the IDEs, because usually what developers do, they work in the IDEs. That's where they have the visibility, the code completion, and then the IDEs are smart enough to figure out the dependencies. Right. So that's one way of doing it. Of course there's other ways. I know from other languages than Java, they actually use Gazelle and others to generate the build files, because there you have a separate system where you declare those dependencies. In Java, you just have the import statements in the source file on the top, and not really knowing where they're coming from. But the IDE would know, so the IDE could put in the labels in the dependencies.
Yeah, exactly. With Gazelle, you would have to sort of duplicate that logic. right? And you were also talking about a tool to enforce standards for visibility. What sort of tools are you using for linting build files, if any?
So far, we have done a very basic linter based on some internal rules. Because, for example, we also have this enforcement around what load statements are allowed in the build files. So we verify that during a check-in, and that's just a custom check for grab for the load statements and check that's in the allow list. And yeah, and visibility is similar, is that we, because also given we're coming from a very different structure, it's not optimized for basic visibility. So we need to have a lot of tight management in the build files till we are out of Maven. Then we can start moving things around into locations or into a hierarchy that makes basic visibility a little bit easier.
Right, thank you.
Hey, since you mentioned this is largely not just a technical journey, but also a people-related journey, I'm wondering how you solved the migration internally to your management, and how do you sell it to your internal teams to be on board with your vision?
Actually, the sell to the management was easy because everyone saw the build times. We had Maven plugins to measure them and collect the data. And also at the same time, there was a general feedback from all the developers that productivity just sucks. And because especially the build time. So we did that experimentation with Bazel, and we could show them there is rebuild from like several seconds instead of 20 minutes, right? Because that's the big advantage. In Maven, you always build everything. Even though we already customized Maven, that 20 minutes was just a subgraph. The full build is much longer. But so given it, like it was an easy sell given the metrics and the numbers. And that's what I would recommend everyone. Like sit down, calculate the numbers, calculate the metrics, because then you can also measure your success, right? And we're now with Bazel, the PAD is around 4 minutes.
PAD?
80 percentile of the build time.